Mrs. Uzo, Namdi's mother, complained to him about his wife. Your wife is lazy, unfaithful, and she's not good for you. Namdi begged his mother to be nicer to Edikan. He told her that Edikan was very helpful to him and gave him a lot of good luck. But Mrs. Uzo could not believe him. How does she give you good luck when she has no job, has never worked a day in her entire life? She lives off of you, and all she does is stay at home and waste your money. Namdi and Edikan were the epitome of a perfect couple. Their love was legendary in their circles, intense, genuine, and unbreakable. They built a beautiful life together, complete with a stunning house and a thriving business empire which Namdi managed while Edikan took care of the home. Yet, beneath the surface of their ideal world, there was a lot of tension between Edikan and Namdi's mother, Mrs. Uzo. She was a formidable woman whose disapproval of Edikan was a constant shadow over their blissful life. Her disdain was palpable, rooted in deep-seated prejudice, and she believed that Edikan stole her son's attention. She saw how successful her son was and believed that Edikan was unworthy of her son. In spite of all the hatred Mrs. Uzo had for Edikan would tell Namdi to be patient and kind to Mama. Edikan was very accommodating and caring. But Mrs. Uzo returned the favor with rude and disrespectful comments. Each time she visited her son, her resentment included a relentless campaign to undermine Edikan's position in Namdi's life. Subtle hints, veiled comments, and outright hostility drive a wedge between the couple. Edikan and Namdi were able to heal their relationship each time his mother created tension between them. But Mrs. Uzo did not like that. Namdi was so loving to his wife. He would buy her gifts, pamper her so much, and spoil her with trips and lots of money. This did not sit right with Mrs. Uzo. She became very jealous of Edikan. How can a woman be this lucky? She doesn't work or do anything, yet she receives so much love from a man. Mrs. Uzo would think to herself, I did not even have this much luck. I was so hardworking, yet I suffered and begged for a man's love. I even had to raise my son by myself. Mrs. Uzo became even more envious of Edikan, and that envy made her more angry. It wasn't long before Mrs. Uzo decided to introduce a new woman into their lives, Ijeoma, a strikingly beautiful woman with an innocent demeanor. Ijeoma was Namdi's childhood best friend. They were so close until Namdi left the country to the UK for further studies. They lost contact and drifted apart. One fateful evening, Mrs. Uzo planned a dinner party where Ijeoma made her grand entrance. Ijeoma was charming, her beauty undeniable. Namdi was completely caught off guard by Ijeoma's presence and Mrs. Uzo's insistence. Ijeoma had grown into an incredibly beautiful young woman, and Namdi stared at her for a while. Edikan noticed the shock in Namdi's demeanor, moved closer to them, and asked for an introduction. After the party, Edikan confronted Namdi with her concerns, but Namdi, torn between his love for Edikan and his obligation to his mother, brushed off her worries with assurances of loyalty and commitment. The next morning, while Edikan went to run errands, Mrs. Uzo brought Ijeoma to Namdi's house. Namdi was furious with his mother, so he lashed out at her. She pretended to be upset and left the house without Ijeoma. Namdi was left in the house with Ijeoma, who tried numerous times to seduce him. Namdi was very irritated by Ijeoma's cheap and seductive attitude. How can you disrespect yourself in such a manner? Why are you chasing a married man who doesn't want you? Jam questions, Ijeoma responded. She ignored his questions and proceeded to sit on him. Namdi was enraged. He grabbed Ijeoma off him and pushed her out the door. Mrs. Uzo kept meddling in her son's marriage, but to no avail. She attacked her daughter-in-law multiple times, hoping she would quit the marriage and leave, but Edikan refused to give in to her mother-in-law. Mrs. Uzo got very frustrated and decided to move into the house with Nnamdi and Edikan. When Mrs. Uzo moved in, she invited Ijeoma to the house. Ijeoma was such a nuisance in Nnamdi's home that each time Nnamdi protested, Mrs. Uzo responded that Ijeoma was her guest and a girl she saw as her child. Both Mrs. Uzo and Ijeoma made life unbearable for Edikan and Nnamdi. Every time Edikan was not around, Ijeoma would attempt to seduce Nnamdi. Nnamdi was very loyal to his wife and would remind Ijeoma that she was his past. It was very difficult for Nnamdi, and he decided to order Ijeoma to leave. But Mrs. Uzo threatened to hurt herself. That forced Nnamdi and Edikan to agree to her request. Mrs. Uzo and Ijeoma were so devious. They treated Edikan like a maid. They locked the kitchen so she could not make food for herself and her husband. Then they would open the kitchen a few minutes before Nnamdi showed up, so it would look like Edikan was lazy and did not care for her husband. Mrs. Uzo cooked and forced Nnamdi to choose her food instead of Edikan's food. Whenever Nnamdi came home late, Mrs. Uzo sat outside the door to welcome her son home, then lied to him that Edikan had just come in right before Nnamdi arrived. Nnamdi questioned Edikan and asked why she was back home so late, but Edikan was shocked because she had been home all evening. Each time Mrs. Uzo and Ijeoma created a rift between the couple, they healed and recovered fast. Their plan was not working the way they wanted, so they came up with a more disastrous plan. While Edikan was at the gym one day, she met a very handsome young man who was sociable. He approached her and was very cordial. Edikan struck up a conversation with him without any bad intention, but she did not know the young man, Fred, was placed there by her mother-in-law. After several meetings at the gym, they exchanged numbers and Fred started texting Edikan at odd hours. This was harmless at first, but slowly became a problem when Fred sent numerous sexual text messages and pictures to Edikan. Edikan's mother-in-law would distract her from her husband while Fred sent sexual texts and messages to her phone so Nnamdi could see them. Nnamdi saw the messages and was furious. He confronted Edikan about the text messages from Fred. Mrs. Uzo heard the argument and rushed to the living room to increase the fire. I just met this man at the gym. We only talk at the gym about workouts and nothing more, Edikan told her husband. I don't understand why he's sending these messages to me, Edikan said. Liar! Mrs. Uzo shouted. Mrs. Uzo lied against Edikan, telling Nnamdi how Fred usually visited the house when Nnamdi was not home. Mrs. Uzo even called Ijeoma as a witness. Ijeoma confirmed the lies as truth. Nnamdi was furious and believed his mother and Ijeoma. Edikan was all alone defending herself. She repeated her explanation to Nnamdi that she just met Fred at the gym and there was nothing attached to it. Nnamdi was greatly upset and decided to confront Fred at the gym. Mrs. Uzo overheard it and told Fred not to show up anymore. Nnamdi went to the gym multiple days but could not find Fred. That made Nnamdi very suspicious because he thought his wife had told Fred not to come to the gym anymore. This drove a big wedge between them, and Edikan was so confused about what her mother-in-law and Ijeoma did to her. Edikan even showed her call logs and message logs to prove that she had never talked to Fred on the phone, and she only said hello to him at the gym. But her husband did not believe her. This issue created a rift between them as Nnamdi became aggressively suspicious of Edikan. Their home became so toxic, full of argument and constant yelling. Edikan was heartbroken that her husband doubted her and believed Mama. She felt alone and deserted. Nnamdi spent more time with his mother and Ijeoma. Edikan decided to go out of town to visit her relative. While she was out there, Mrs. Uzo and Ijeoma found the best opportunity to make sure there was no marriage for her to come back to. A week later, when Nnamdi returned home from work, his mother and Ijeoma had prepared dinner and set the table for him. He had no appetite for food. He had been calling his wife all day, but she refused to pick up his calls. So he went to his room to rest, and his mother brought some chilled juice for him to drink. He refused at first, but she cajoled him into drinking. As soon as Nnamdi was done drinking, he became very drowsy and just slumped into his bed. Mama shook and called him a few times to check if he was conscious, but Nnamdi did not respond. Mrs. Uzo called out to Ijeoma, who ran into the bedroom, dressed in her favorite lingerie. Ijeoma climbed into the bed. She grabbed Nnamdi's phone and used his thumb to unlock the phone, pretended to be Nnamdi, and texted Edikan. The text was frantic, scary, and emotional. Edikan thought something had happened to her husband Nnamdi, so she responded that she would be home first thing in the morning, as there was no flight to bring her back home that night. Ijeoma spent the night with Nnamdi. She stripped him of his clothes and stayed beside him until morning. The sleeping pill was so strong that it knocked Nnamdi out all night. He was still asleep when Edikan rushed back to the house the following morning. She called out for Nnamdi, then rushed upstairs to their bedroom. When she opened the door, she froze. Ijeoma was on top of Nnamdi, and Edikan could not see that Nnamdi was still asleep. Edikan screamed and rushed to drag Ijeoma off her husband. Nnamdi heard the loud scream and commotion, and he jumped up. As he jumped, he noticed that he only had his boxers. He looked at Edikan, who was furious and ready to pounce on someone. Edikan charged at her husband, demanding answers. In his confused state, he said the most foolish thing. "You started it. You were having an affair with Fred, and I called you yesterday, but you did not pick up your call." Mrs. Uzo rushed in to defend Ijeoma and her son. Edikan froze at the answer Nnamdi gave and realized there was no redemption. She calmed herself down and said, "I give up. You all can have each other. I am done fighting." She choked up in tears and walked out of the room. Nnamdi realized what just happened. He had just lost his marriage and his amazing wife. He rushed to beg Edikan, but his mother got in front of him and closed the door. By the time he was able to move his mother out of the way and open the door, Edikan had gone. Her phone was switched off and no one knew where she was at. Mrs. Uzo and Ijeoma laughed and celebrated in the house. "Now that the girl has gone, I can now relax in my son's house and Ijeoma can take over everything," said Mrs. Uzo. "All the cars, the money, and the businesses, they're all for my son Nnamdi." Nnamdi panicked and paced up and down the house. He knew exactly what was going to happen, but he could not tell his mother. He tried to get his mother to move back to the village, but she insisted, "Why do I have to leave now when we have the house all to ourselves?" The next day, as Nnamdi tried to gain access to the company, Edikan's security team barred him from entering. He tried numerous times to reach Edikan and explained to her, but her phone was switched off. He begged the security guards to allow him to take his personal belongings. So they escorted him to the office and inspected everything he took. They marched him to the house and ordered everyone to leave. Ijeoma and Mrs. Uzo were confused. Nnamdi informed them that he did not own anything. He had met Edikan in school and they were very good friends. So when he came back into the country and couldn't find a job, he reached out to Edikan, who spoke with her dad to offer him a job as his associate. Nnamdi had served Edikan's family so well and had an excellent reputation. Nnamdi's intelligence and expertise were a great asset to the company. Edikan's father trusted Nnamdi and always told him to look out for Edikan. He promised that he would always protect Edikan. When Edikan's parents passed away from a plane crash, Nnamdi helped Edikan to heal. They spent so much time together, fell in love and got married. Edikan gave the companies to Nnamdi to manage because as her father's closest associate, he knew about all the deals and contracts. Nnamdi knew more about the company than Edikan did. His reputation and integrity also made it very easy for Edikan to trust him with all the businesses. He informed his mother that Edikan owned everything, the house, cars, businesses, and all the money. He was just an employee in her company. His mother slumped to the ground. Ijeoma wondered how a girl who had so much influence and affluence tolerated so much nonsense from them. Nnamdi turned to his mother. "I told you to leave her alone. I told you she was my good luck charm. She made my life so beautiful, but you would not listen. Now look at what you have done to me. You have destroyed my life, Mama." The security teams ordered them out of the house, took all the keys from them, and they only left with their belongings. Nnamdi moved back to his mother's house. He refused to speak to her or eat her food. His mother begged for forgiveness, but Nnamdi ignored her. Mrs. Uzor was tortured by guilt and decided to tell Nnamdi all she did. Nnamdi heard the truth about Fred and all the lies his mother had made up against Edikan. He was so hurt and heartbroken for Edikan. How could I have allowed my mother to turn me against my wife? I was supposed to protect her from everyone and everything. I had promised her father that I would protect her, but I failed when she needed me. When I needed her, she was there. When I had nothing, she was there. And look at how I repaid her. Nnamdi wept inconsolably, so much that guilt and his thoughts punished him dearly. He made several attempts to meet up with Edikan, to talk to her, but she declined. She had taken up the CEO position of her companies and focused on her role, but she struggled because she did not have much experience. Few months later, the revenue in the company started declining, and Edikan was struggling to win contracts for the firm. The board of directors began to question her competence and even suggested replacing her if she did not sit up. In a desperate bid to salvage what was left, Nnamdi heard from his associate that Edikan's company was struggling. He approached Edikan in an attempt to help her win the company back. Edikan's response was measured but firm. She had no intention of returning to a relationship that had been so deeply fractured, but she could create a mutually beneficial relationship. Under Nnamdi's leadership, the company won more contracts and thrived so well. Edikan needed an experienced leader, and Nnamdi needed finances to rebuild his life. So Edikan offered Nnamdi the role of a contract advisor. Nnamdi became an independent counselor for the company and was paid well. He accepted Edikan's offer, though it was a humbling experience. He began to work on rebuilding his life. Nnamdi's relationship with his mother was badly strained, and the reality of his decisions was evident in every facet of his existence. Mrs. Uzor was consumed by guilt as she saw the consequences of her actions unfold. She had hoped for a happy ending for her son, but had instead created a nightmare. Her feeling of responsibility and remorse led her to seek a way to make amends. Mrs. Uzor made efforts to reconcile with Edikan, acknowledging her mistakes and the harm she had caused. Edikan, ever so gracious, accepted Mrs. Uzor's attempt at redemption, but remained cautious. She told her that she had forgiven them, but stated clearly and firmly that forgiveness did not mean she wanted the marriage back. Nnamdi kept working for the company, focusing on making amends and proving his commitment to the company. Despite his effort to rekindle the relationship, Edikan was very cautious not to allow herself be pulled into another nightmare, as she did not want Nnamdi to have to choose between Edikan and Nnamdi's mother. After Nnamdi had recovered financially, he decided to terminate his contract with Edikan's firm because he couldn't stand seeing the woman he loved so much be so far away from him. Edikan embarked on a new chapter in her life, focusing on her career and personal growth. After a few years, in an unexpected turn of events, Nnamdi and Edikan crossed paths at a business event. The encounter was charged with emotion, and both had grown significantly since their separation. The meeting sparked a renewed sense of hope and possibility. Nnamdi and Edikan began to rebuild their friendship, establishing a new understanding of each other. They began collaborating on projects. Nnamdi helped her win more contracts. Their partnership was very successful. As time passed, the wounds of the past began to heal. Nnamdi and Edikan's interaction became more comfortable. They found solace in their shared experience. The process of healing was gradual but transformative. Nnamdi and Edikan's renewed connection evolved into a deeper bond. Their relationship was marked by trust, respect, and a shared vision for their lives. The end. If you were Edikan, would you give the relationship a second chance? And what would you do with your mother-in-law? Please leave your response in the comment section. I would love to read them. Thank you so much for sharing and subscribing to my channel. See you in the next story. Bye.